The notification arrived not as a dramatic pronouncement, but as a stiff, formal letter on thick, cream-colored paper. Marcus, a historian whose life revolved around the meticulous dissection of dead facts, regarded the envelope with a faint academic disinterest. His world was one of dusty archives and obscure primary sources, a quiet, predictable existence he had cultivated with deliberate intent. Human interaction, especially the kind that led to unexpected inheritances, was an anomaly he usually avoided. He unfolded the document, his fingers, accustomed to brittle parchment, feeling the unusual weight of the modern paper. It detailed the passing of a distant, almost forgotten relative and, more significantly, the transfer of an estate named Blackwood Manor. The name itself carried a faint, unbidden resonance, a whisper of old stories Marcus had long dismissed as folklore. The accompanying legal brief from the solicitor outlined the property's considerable age and its profound isolation. Blackwood Manor. He recalled a vague childhood memory of a hushed conversation, a warning about the place being unsettled. Marcus had categorized such remarks under local superstition, a quaint but ultimately baseless human tendency to imbue the unknown with malevolent intent. His intellect rejected such romanticized notions. The world operated on discernible principles, not spectral whispers. Still, the sheer scale of the inheritance necessitated his attention. His own dwelling, a compact apartment overflowing with books, offered little in the way of space for the sprawling collection of historical artifacts he'd always dreamed of acquiring. Blackwood Manor, despite its dubious reputation, represented an opportunity for expansion, a private archive of unparalleled scope. The journey west was long, a deliberate withdrawal from the familiar, structured landscape of the city. The paved roads gave way to narrower tracks, then to stretches of gravel that kicked up dust like dry bone meal. His rental car, a practical, unadorned sedan, felt increasingly vulnerable against the encroaching wildness. At one point, he encountered a border checkpoint. A single, weathered hut stood beside a rudimentary gate, manned by a stoic, silent guard who examined Marcus's identification with an unhurried scrutiny. The guard's gaze, flat and unblinking, seemed to linger, as if searching for something beyond the official documents. He offered no greeting, no instruction, merely a slow nod that allowed Marcus to proceed. Marcus attributed it to the guard's uniform, a faint residue of the official sterile world he was leaving behind. Hours later, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, the manor finally emerged from the dense, ancient woods. It was not merely old. It was decrepit in a way that defied simple decay. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from beneath heavy, slatted shutters. The drive leading to the main entrance was choked with weeds, the gravel path barely discernible. Marcus parked the car near a massive wrought iron gate, half off its hinges, that leaned precariously into the overgrown grounds. The air here was heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth, decaying leaves, and something else. A faint, musty odor, like old paper and forgotten secrets. He stepped out, the crunch of dead leaves under his boots unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. He surveyed the manor. Its sheer scale was daunting, its architecture a haphazard accumulation of centuries, each addition seemingly bolted onto the last without regard for symmetry or grace. The roofline sagged in places, tiles missing like broken teeth. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, snaked across the stone facade, asserting a slow, persistent reclamation. Marcus felt a subtle shift within him, a flicker of something beyond academic curiosity. He dismissed it as the natural reaction to such a formidable, decaying structure. He retrieved the heavy iron key from his pocket, its cold metal a stark contrast to the surprisingly warm air that had momentarily clung to him in the car. He leaned his full weight against it, and with a groan that seemed to echo from the very depths of the house, it slowly yielded. A wave of frigid air, thick with dust and the unmistakable scent of stagnation, washed over him. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams like countless tiny lost spirits. Marcus stepped across the threshold, his skepticism a shield against the unsettling atmosphere. This was merely an old house, neglected and in disrepair. The feeling of being watched, of a profound, ancient awareness, was merely the trick of an overactive imagination, a byproduct of the isolation and the local legends he had so readily dismissed. He closed the door behind him, the heavy thud echoing through the vast, empty space, sealing him within. The journey to the manor was protracted, a deliberate excision from the world Marcus knew. He drove for 2 days, the landscape gradually shedding its urban sprawl for a sparse, unforgiving wilderness of ancient pines and granite outcrops. The final barrier was a remote border checkpoint, a stark concrete booth manned by a uniformed officer whose eyes, behind the thick glass, held a weary, almost bored scrutiny. Marcus presented his identification, the legal documents pertaining to the inheritance lying neatly on the passenger seat. The officer merely glanced at the papers, his gaze lingering on the stacks of archival boxes crammed into the back of Marcus's vehicle. "Historian," the officer stated, his voice flat, a rhetorical observation rather than a question. Marcus nodded. "That's correct." A moment of silence stretched, punctuated by the faint hum of the idling engine. The officer handed back Marcus's documents. "Long way to move a library." "It's a significant collection," Marcus replied, maintaining his composure. He had anticipated some curiosity, perhaps even a local warning, but the officer merely waved him through, the barrier arm lifting with a groan of aged machinery. The interaction was devoid of warmth, yet also of any dramatic portent, precisely the kind of sterile exchange Marcus preferred. He continued, the paved road quickly deteriorating into a gravel track, then a deeply rutted dirt path. The manor emerged from the dense forest like a forgotten monument. Its stone facade was dark, streaked with lichen, the windows like vacant eyes under heavy brows of slate. It was larger than photographs suggested, a sprawling, asymmetrical structure that seemed to have grown organically over centuries. Marcus pulled his vehicle into a cobbled courtyard, the crunch of tires on stone echoing in the oppressive quiet. A gust of wind, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves, rattled a loose shutter somewhere on the upper floors. He felt a familiar academic curiosity stir within him, a professional detachment that insulated him from the gloom. This was a historical site, a canvas of human endeavor and decay. Nothing more. Unpacking was a methodical process, a ritual Marcus had performed countless times in various temporary residences. Box after box of books, journals, microfiches, and research notes were carried inside. He chose the largest room on the ground floor as his temporary study, a space with tall, leaded windows overlooking a neglected garden. Here, he began to arrange his materials, stacking reference texts on the heavy oak table he'd salvaged from the dining hall, organizing his primary sources into meticulous piles. On the second day, as he sorted through a collection of 18th century parish records, Marcus noticed a subtle shift in the room's ambient temperature. He paused, his fingers still on the brittle parchment, and assessed the phenomenon. "Poor insulation," he concluded. The old stone walls were thick, but certainly not airtight. A draft, perhaps, from a hidden crack or a faulty chimney flue. He made a mental note to investigate it later, dismissing the sensation as an architectural peculiarity. Later that evening, while attempting to decipher a particularly cramped script under the glow of a single desk lamp, he heard it. A faint, breathy murmur like dry leaves skittering across a distant stone floor. It seemed to emanate from the hallway, just beyond the closed study door. Marcus stiffened, his head cocked, listening intently. He waited, but it did not repeat. The old house settling, he reasoned. Wood contracting, the ancient structure groaning under its own immense weight. The manor was a vast, complex mechanism of timber and stone, prone to its own internal dialogues. He continued his work, though a faint, almost imperceptible tension had begun to knot itself in his shoulders. The following morning, a small leather-bound volume, one of his personal notebooks containing transcribed interviews from a previous project, was not where he had left it. He distinctly remembered placing it on the top shelf of the makeshift bookcase he'd assembled. Now it rested on the large oak table, directly beneath a pile of unread local histories. Marcus stared at it, a frown deepening on his face. He was meticulous, almost pathologically so, about the placement of his research materials. A momentary lapse, he decided. Exhaustion from the move, perhaps. His mind, accustomed to the precise ordering of historical facts, occasionally faltered in the mundane present. He picked up the notebook, returning it to its designated place with a deliberate, almost defiant precision. As the week progressed, these small anomalies accumulated. Objects continued to shift. A pen found inside a closed book it had no business being in. A stack of geological surveys moved from one end of the table to the other. Marcus rationalized each instance with increasing vigor. Drafts, auditory illusions, absent-mindedness, the inevitable disarray of a large-scale research project. His skepticism was a formidable fortress, buttressed by years of academic rigor. One afternoon, while clearing out a forgotten pantry adjacent to the study, a small wooden chest was discovered tucked beneath a loose floorboard. It was crude, unvarnished, and surprisingly heavy. They were bound in faded blue leather, their pages yellowed and fragile. The script was elegant but erratic, almost frantic in places. The first journal bore the inscription, Eleanor Vance, 1789. Marcus opened it carefully, the dry paper crackling softly. The initial entries were mundane, chronicling domestic duties and local events. Watchful, an entry read, dated October 1792. It rearranges my thoughts, the very objects of my life. Another, from the following spring. My memories blur. Marcus cannot recall where Marcus placed the locket. It was here, only yesterday. He denies ever seeing it. The pronouns were vague, the struggles deeply personal, yet unsettlingly familiar. A later entry, barely legible, scrawled in a hand that seemed to tremble even on the page. It consumes. It hungers. The house is not merely stone. It is a being. Marcus closed the journal slowly, the ancient leather cool beneath his fingertips. He stared at the cryptic words, then at the empty, echoing room around him. His historian's mind, always seeking patterns, connections, felt a distinct tremor. These were not the ramblings of a singular, isolated individual. They described phenomena that, despite his rigorous rationalizations, resonated with his own recent, inexplicable experiences. He picked up another journal from the chest, its cover unmarked, its secrets waiting. The journal lay open on the heavy oak table, its brittle pages whispering of forgotten lives. Marcus traced a finger along the faded script, his brow furrowed in concentration. The previous owner's entries, initially dismissed as the ravings of a solitary mind, now carried a faint, unsettling resonance. He pushed away the nascent unease. A historian's task was to analyze, to categorize, not to succumb to fanciful notions. A soft scrape echoed from the ceiling directly above him. He paused, head tilted. The old house settled, perhaps. He resumed reading. Minutes later, a distinct, rhythmic tap, tap, tap emanated from the wall beside the fireplace, like a small, persistent knuckle rapping against plaster. Marcus looked up, eyes scanning the unblemished surface. Silence. He waited, listening to the subtle creaks and groans of the ancient structure. Nothing. It was a trick of the old timbers, he decided, or the wind playing games with a loose shutter. Later that evening, while documenting the manor's extensive library, a different sound surfaced. It wasn't a distinct word, more a breathy, indistinct current of voices, like a distant, hushed conversation just beyond his hearing. He spun around, surveying the empty room, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light from his lantern. The sound vanished. He shook his head, a faint irritation stirring. Fatigue, he reasoned. The isolation was beginning to play on his senses. A flicker in the periphery as he turned a corner, a momentary deepening of the gloom that resolved into nothing upon direct inspection. He attributed these to the manor's uneven lighting, the ancient glass of the windows distorting the late afternoon sun, or simply the natural limitations of human sight. His academic mind sought logical explanations, a bulwark against the subtle erosion of his composure. Sleep offered no refuge. Marcus found himself trapped in a recurring nightmare. He stood alone at a desolate, fog-shrouded border checkpoint. Barbed wire stretched endlessly into the gray. He carried nothing, yet a crushing weight pressed down on him. An unseen official demanded papers he did not possess, a reason for passage he could not articulate. The barrier ahead remained impassable, a heavy, rusted gate that groaned softly in the wind. The feeling of being scrutinized, judged, and utterly trapped was overwhelming. Determined to find answers beyond his increasingly unreliable senses, Marcus immersed himself in the manor's archives. He worked for hours in the drafty study, surrounded by ledgers, letters, and faded photographs. He meticulously cross-referenced family trees with local municipal records, piecing together the fractured narratives of previous inhabitants. A disturbing pattern began to emerge, stark and undeniable. The manor had a history of attracting individuals seeking solitude, artists, scholars, and eccentrics, much like himself. But their tenures within its walls rarely ended peacefully. There was the painter, Elias Thorne, who, after 5 years of seclusion, was found incoherent, muttering about voices in the stone before disappearing completely. His final journal entries descended into frantic, repetitive scrawls, detailing how the walls drank his thoughts. Then there was Lady Eleanor Vance, a botanist who, after a decade, reportedly took his own life in the East Wing, leaving behind a note that spoke of the house's hungry memory and a pervasive sense of being unmade. A local constable's report from that era mentioned the unnatural quiet of the manor, a stillness that seemed to press in on the mind. Marcus discovered references to a reclusive scholar named Alistair Finch, who, after a prolonged period of isolation, was discovered by a distant relative in a state of profound catatonia, his eyes fixed on an unseen point in the ceiling, his lips moving soundlessly. He never recovered. The relative's testimony spoke of Finch's obsession with the manor's living pulse and its consuming hunger. The records, spanning centuries, painted a consistent picture. Individuals drawn to the manor, extended isolation within its confines, followed by a descent into madness, unexplained disappearances, or self-inflicted demise. The common thread was not just solitude, but a prolonged, uninterrupted residency within the manor's walls. Marcus's historian's mind, always seeking patterns, connections, felt a distinct tremor. These were not the ramblings of singular, isolated individuals, but echoes across generations converging on a singular, terrifying premise. He closed the ledger, the heavy leather cover thudding softly. The brittle parchment in Marcus's hands felt suddenly heavy, a leaden testament to the weight of centuries. The previous inhabitants, the records detailed, had not merely succumbed to isolation. They had been consumed. He lowered the document, the faint scent of aged paper and dust clinging to his fingertips. The study, once a sanctuary of historical inquiry, now felt like an antechamber to something vast and inescapable. A low groan emanated from the floorboards above, a sound Marcus had dismissed as structural decay or settling wood. Now it resonated with a different quality, almost a sigh. The air, previously cool and dry, seemed to thicken, carrying a faint metallic tang, like old blood or rusted iron, barely perceptible yet persistent. He closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his palms against his sockets. Exhaustion, he concluded. The relentless hours of research, the dim light, the oppressive quiet. When he opened them again, the room had shifted. Not physically, but in perception. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more fluid. Marcus blinked, and it was gone, replaced by the familiar sheen of wood. His breath hitched. This was not fatigue. This was something else. Later, as he walked through the great hall, the silence was broken by a sudden sharp crack, like a whip. It echoed from the direction of the drawing room. Marcus hesitated, every instinct urging him to investigate, yet an uncharacteristic reluctance held him. He pushed past it, determined to maintain his rational composure. He entered the drawing room. Nothing. The antique furnishings stood undisturbed, cloaked in dust sheets. Yet, a faint lingering scent of lavender and something acrid, like burnt sugar, hung in the air. Then it happened. Not a sound, but a visual intrusion. The air above the grand fireplace shimmered, distorting the aged portrait hanging there. For a fleeting instant, the heavy velvet drapes around the tall windows dissolved, replaced by a scene of frantic activity. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her eyes darting to the unseen presence beyond the door. He could almost hear her choked sob. The vision vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving Marcus gasping for air, leaning heavily against the doorframe. He ran a hand over his face, the skin clammy. This was no trick of the light, no overactive imagination. He had felt her fear. He had been there. He retreated to the study, the weight of the manor pressing in. He poured a glass of water, his hand shaking, the liquid sloshing over the rim. He tried to focus, to rationalize. He was a historian. He dealt with facts, with evidence. But what evidence was this? A fragment of a memory, alien yet utterly visceral. The manor was no longer just a collection of old walls and forgotten lives. It was a repository, a living archive of anguish. He felt its scrutiny, a pervasive, unseen gaze that followed him from room to room. He was being observed, judged, perhaps even sampled. The air around him felt denser, charged with an unspoken expectation. He walked to the window, staring out at the desolate grounds. The mist had begun to roll in, obscuring the distant trees. It was as if the manor had absorbed him, severing his connection to anything beyond its stone embrace. He saw a stark, concrete barrier, topped with barbed wire, stretching into a gray, featureless distance. A vehicle, old and battered, sat idle, its engine silent. There was a palpable sense of desperation, of a final, insurmountable obstacle. This was not his memory. He had never been to such a place, never experienced such utter hopelessness. Yet the feeling was profoundly his in that moment, as if a thread of someone else's ultimate failure had been woven directly into his own consciousness. Marcus stumbled back from the window, his knees weak. The border checkpoint, a final, insurmountable barrier. And now he was experiencing it. The manor was not merely replaying memories. It was implanting them, weaving them into the fabric of his own perception. The house was not haunted. It was consuming. An irreversible fading. His gaze traced the faded ink, a cold dread seeping into his bones, far deeper than any chill from the ancient stone. He dismissed it, of course. Superstition, a dramatic flourish from a bygone era. Yet the word resonated with a peculiar resonance in the vast, silent house. He slammed the folio shut, the sound echoing through the library, a sharp, defiant crack against the prevailing quiet. This was absurd. He was a scholar, a rationalist. He needed distance, perspective, a change of scenery. He needed to leave. He moved towards the study door, an inexplicable lethargy settling over his limbs. The air felt thick, almost viscous, making each breath a conscious effort. This was merely fatigue, the product of too many sleepless nights spent poring over dusty texts. He walked to the main hall, the silence amplifying the scuff of his shoes on the polished floor. His mobile phone, which he'd left charging on a small table near the entrance, lay inert. He picked it up. He pressed the power button repeatedly, then tried connecting it to a different outlet. Nothing. The device was dead, utterly. A minor inconvenience, he told himself, but a prickle of irritation began to spread. He found the landline in the drawing room. He lifted it to his ear. A faint, persistent hum, like a distant swarm of insects, was the only sound. No dial tone. Marcus frowned. The lines had been working just yesterday, albeit with some static. He tried another extension in the kitchen. The same hum, devoid of any connection. This was more than a coincidence. Immediately, he went upstairs collecting a small bag. He packed a few essentials, his movements sluggish, as if wading through unseen water. His gaze drifted to the window, overlooking the manicured yet strangely wild gardens. A peculiar warmth, almost a possessiveness, seemed to emanate from the walls, wrapping around him, a silent invitation to stay, to sink deeper into its embrace. He fought it, pushing down the odd, appealing sense of surrender. His car was still parked in the gravel driveway, a familiar silver shape against the manor's gray stone. He started the engine. It coughed, then caught, a reassuring roar in the suffocating quiet. He reversed, the crunch of tires on gravel a welcome sound of normalcy. Freedom. The narrow, winding road, overgrown with tangled hedgerows, felt longer than he remembered. He drove for what felt like hours, the landscape blurring into a monotonous green and gray. He aimed for the closest established crossing point, a border checkpoint he knew was roughly 100 miles away. He just needed to reach it, to see a different face, hear a different voice, to prove that the manor's hold was purely psychological. The air in the car grew heavy, a subtle, almost imperceptible pressure. His eyelids felt weighted, his thoughts sluggish. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, forcing himself to focus. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the lines on the asphalt blurring into a continuous gray ribbon. He finally saw it, a low, concrete structure, stark against the muted landscape. The border checkpoint. A single vehicle, a weathered sedan, was ahead of him, stationary. A uniformed official stood beside it, speaking to the driver. Marcus pulled up behind, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He watched the interaction, waiting for his turn. The official, a man with a stern, impassive face, finished his conversation and turned. He looked directly at Marcus's car. Their eyes met. The official's gaze was unsettlingly blank, devoid of recognition, or even curiosity. He simply stared, then, without a word, turned his back and walked over to a small booth by the side of the road, disappearing inside. The sedan ahead of Marcus remained motionless. Marcus waited, his foot hovering over the accelerator. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sedan didn't move. The official didn't re-emerge. A profound sense of futility washed over him. He leaned forward, trying to discern any movement from the sedan or the booth. The world beyond the manor seemed to have simply ceased. The fight drained out of him. He reversed slowly, then turned the car around. He dropped his bag by the door. The idea of food, of sleep, felt distant, irrelevant. His determination, once a fierce flame, had dwindled to a dying ember. He ran a hand through his hair, noticing the unfamiliar grease, the faint smell of dust clinging to his clothes. He hadn't showered in days. Had he? The concept of time seemed to blur. It had consumed his attempts to leave, his connections to the outside. Now it was beginning to consume him. The word resonated with an unnerving finality, a clinical assessment of a catastrophic process. A prolonged, uninterrupted residence within the manor's confines invariably led To what, precisely? The documents became increasingly cryptic, the penmanship deteriorating, phrases trailing off into incoherent scrawls. Marcus found himself rereading the same paragraph, searching for a clarity that dissolved with each pass, the ink blurring on the page. He rubbed his temples. The air in the study felt stagnant, thick with the scent of aged paper and something else. Something subtly metallic, like old blood or forgotten iron. He pushed away from the heavy oak desk, the chair scraping loudly on the flagstone floor. The sound seemed to reverberate excessively, echoing down unseen corridors, a small disturbance in the profound silence of the manor. He had walked that route countless times. Down the main hall, past the grand staircase, through the portrait gallery, then a sharp right into the library antechamber. A familiar trajectory. Yet, as he stepped into the main hall, a subtle disjunction occurred. The tapestries, usually depicting faded hunting scenes, now seemed to show stylized anatomical diagrams, intricate and unsettling, their threads woven with a disturbing precision. He blinked. The images flickered, returning to their original benign forms. He attributed it to fatigue, a trick of the light, an overactive imagination fueled by the disturbing texts. He continued, his footsteps unnaturally loud. The grand staircase loomed, its dark wood gleaming. He paused. Had there always been that additional banister post, intricately carved with a snarling leonine face, positioned midway up the first flight? He was certain it had not been there before. The wood felt unnervingly warm beneath his fingers, as if recently handled. A ripple of unease spread through him. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. The manor was old, constantly revealing forgotten details. The portrait gallery, however, presented a more significant deviation. Her eyes, usually a dull gray, now appeared to possess a disconcerting vibrancy, a knowing glint. We must maintain appearances, mustn't we, Lady Eleanor? The staff must never suspect. The thought was not his own. It was a stray fragment, a voice in his mind that carried the timbre of another era, another personality. Lady Eleanor? He knew no Lady Eleanor. He was Marcus. He pressed on, determined to reach the library. The antechamber should have been next. It was stark, sterile, unlike anything else in the manor. White walls, a low, buzzing fluorescent light overhead, and a polished linoleum floor. At the far end, a counter-height desk spanned the passage, behind which sat a single empty chair. Above it, a digital display glowed with the words, "Border checkpoint. All entries require validation." Marcus stared. The incongruity was absolute, a stark violation of architectural and historical logic. This was not a part of the manor. It could not be. He took a hesitant step forward. The air here felt different, drier, carrying a faint chemical odor. No dust. This section was immaculately clean, almost new. He looked around. There were no doors, no windows, only the continuation of the white corridor, stretching into an indeterminate distance beyond the checkpoint. He gripped the edge of the desk for support. The images were distant, hazy, like photographs left too long in the sun. A name from the manor's past, a man consumed by its secrets. Marcus M. Alistair Thorne. A voice whispered in his mind, clear and unwavering. Marcus must secure the Eastern Passage. He looked at his hands. They were his hands, scarred from a childhood accident, the knuckles slightly enlarged from years of gripping heavy tomes. But they felt unfamiliar, as if he were viewing them through a pane of thick glass. He tried to recall his last meal, the book he had been reading before the parchment. The details were fragmented, obscured by a dense fog. What was he doing here? He turned, intending to retrace his steps. The corridor behind him, the one through which he had arrived, had vanished. In its place was another segment of the sterile white passage, identical to the one before him, leading to another identical border checkpoint, complete with its empty chair and glowing sign. He was caught between two identical, unyielding barriers, a prisoner in a corridor that defied spatial reasoning. The manor was not merely shifting, it was fabricating new realities, constructing a labyrinth within his own dissolving consciousness. He was no longer just in the house. The house was now inside him, mapping its impossible dimensions onto his very being. And the manor was the architect of his disintegration. He opened his eyes, the words echoing in the silence of the border checkpoint. He looked at his hands, but they felt. A fluorescent hum pulsed overhead, casting a sterile, sickly yellow light across the plastic laminate of the counter before him. The air smelled of stale coffee and a faint chemical disinfectant. He was seated in a stiff, molded chair, the kind designed for utility over comfort. A uniformed guard stood opposite, his expression neutral, his gaze fixed on a monitor. A faint, repetitive thump-thump-thump emanated from somewhere behind a closed door, like a heavy rubber stamp being applied with methodical precision. "Marcus," the guard stated, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. "Your documents." Marcus blinked. Documents? He reached into his jacket, his fingers brushing against a worn leather wallet he vaguely recognized as his own. He extracted a passport. His own face stared back from the laminated page, slightly younger, less weary. A faint tremor ran through his hand as he presented it. "Purpose of visit?" the guard asked, his eyes still on the screen, a cursor blinking. Purpose of visit. The question hung in the air, vast and empty. Why was he here? Where was here, the border checkpoint? He knew the words, but the context eluded him. A memory, fleeting and indistinct, of endless corridors and the scent of damp stone brushed against his mind, then dissolved like smoke. He swallowed, his throat suddenly parched. Research, Marcus managed, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. He was a historian. That much he knew. He studied ancient things, things with weight and history. But what research brought him to this specific anonymous checkpoint? The guard finally looked up, his eyes a pale, disconcerting blue. Research into what, exactly? Marcus's mind raced, a frantic search through a library with blank spines. He remembered Blackwood Manor, the inheritance, the crumbling facade, the pervasive chill that seeped into bone, the whispers that were not quite whispers. But the connection, the logical thread that linked the manor to this checkpoint, was severed. It was as if a crucial paragraph had been excised from his own narrative. The history of the region, he improvised, the lie tasting like ash. His conviction wavered. The guard nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "And your last known address?" "Blackwood Manor," Marcus replied instantly, the name forming on his lips with an unsettling ease. It felt like home, or perhaps, more accurately, like a cage. The word resonated, a low thrum against his eardrums. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of the guard's mouth, then vanished. He stamped the passport with a sharp, decisive thwack, the sound echoing the distant thumps. "Welcome," he said, pushing the document back across the counter. Marcus took the passport, his fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface. He stood, feeling strangely lightheaded, as if his feet barely touched the ground. Why had the guard smiled? And why did Blackwood Manor feel like a trap he was still caught in, even here? He paused, a sudden horrifying clarity cutting through the disorientation. The memories. Not just gone, but taken. He remembered dismissing it as psychological decay, the ravages of isolation. Isolation did not leave him with a full comprehension of being a historian, yet no knowledge of his current historical pursuit. It wasn't just a house. It was a predator. The manor didn't merely contain malevolent energies. It was the malevolence. It was a sentient entity feeding, not on blood, not on fear alone, but on something far more insidious, the very fabric of identity. Memories, sanity, life force. Each forgotten detail, each moment of confusion, each flicker of doubt was sustenance. It grew stronger with every victim, its reach extending, its hunger deepening. He was its current preferred meal. A faint cloying scent, like damp earth and decaying leaves, wafted past him, entirely out of place in the sterile environment of the border checkpoint. He shivered, despite the moderate temperature. The walls seemed to breathe, the fluorescent lights to pulse with a faint, malevolent rhythm. He saw the guards' pale eyes again, and for a fleeting instant, they seemed ancient, impossibly old, like stones weathered by forgotten centuries. The border checkpoint, the guard, the passport. They were all constructs, illusions woven by the entity to keep him disoriented, to prolong the feeding. He wasn't truly here. He was still within Blackwood Manor, trapped in a meticulously crafted hallucination designed to drain him dry. The manor had learned. It had adapted. It wasn't content with simple haunting. It was a sophisticated, patient hunter, toying with its prey, eroding its will, before consuming the final vital spark. He was Marcus. He would fight, even if his only weapon was his fragmented intellect against an entity that fed on thought itself. Not yet. The air at the border checkpoint was thin, tasting of exhaust fumes and an underlying metallic tang. He had spoken the name, Blackwood Manor, with a strange, unbidden reverence, as if it were a sacred vow. The ease of it had been alarming, a soft slip into an identity not entirely his own. A sudden jarring cough from a waiting motorist nearby pierced the haze. It was a harsh, human sound, raw and unadorned. For a fraction of a second, the house's insistent whisper receded like a tide pulling back from the shore. A cold, stark clarity rushed in, sharp and painful. He was at a border checkpoint. He was leaving. Or he had been leaving. He remembered the packed bags, the desperate urgency to escape. Why had he stopped? Why had he spoken the name? His hands, he noticed, were trembling. Not subtly, but with a violent tremor that rattled his bones. His knuckles were white where he gripped a forgotten travel bag. The house had woven its tendrils into his very thoughts, nudging him, guiding him, turning his escape into a return. It had almost succeeded. Almost. The realization was a punch to the gut. He wasn't just being haunted, he was being controlled. The manor wasn't just influencing him, it was actively manipulating his will, twisting his intentions. This was not a passive malevolence. This was a predator. He dropped the bag. The thud was insignificant against the roar of a passing truck, but to Marcus, it was a declaration, a defiance. He spun on his heel, ignoring the curious glance of a customs officer. Every step was a struggle against an invisible current, a growing pressure against his mind. The house was calling, a low, resonant hum in his skull, urging him to re-enter its embrace, to surrender. No, not this time. The drive back was a blur of heightened senses. Its windows, even from afar, appeared to watch him, ancient eyes tracking his forced return. He parked the vehicle haphazardly on the gravel drive, the tires crunching like breaking bones. He stepped inside, not with resignation, but with a furious resolve. The house breathed around him, a slow, deliberate inhalation. He moved through the echoing halls, his gaze no longer that of a scholar fascinated by history, but of a man desperately searching for a weapon. He went to his study, not for comfort, but for answers. His research, the very texts that had drawn him into this nightmare, might hold the key. He pulled volumes from shelves, scattering parchment and leather-bound tomes across the floor. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light filtering through the grimy windows, like tiny, agitated spirits. He had dismissed them as folklore, symptoms of an isolated community. Now he saw them as victims, their stories a testament to the manor's enduring hunger. He tore through the piles, his fingers raw from turning brittle pages. He needed something specific, not just an explanation, but a vulnerability. He remembered a recurring symbol in some of the oldest documents, a complex knotwork resembling roots, often accompanied by cryptic annotations in a language he had struggled to translate. It was usually depicted near mentions of the heart of the stone, or the binding. His eyes darted across a faded, hand-drawn map of the manor's original foundations, unearthed from a hidden compartment in the library just weeks prior. The knotwork symbol was etched onto a section labeled Subterranean Vault, a space he had never managed to locate. Beneath the symbol, a single looping word in archaic Latin, vinculum, the binding. He remembered the word from a particularly obscure text, a journal entry from a distant ancestor. The author had written of a great weight, a living stone that drank the light and the spirit. The text spoke of a ritual, a severing of the umbilical, to starve the root. It was vague, terrifying, but it offered a direction. The journal detailed a specific sequence of actions, involving a series of carved stones and a sacrifice of memory. Marcus paused, the journal clutched in his trembling hand. Sacrifice of memory. The house fed on memories. To sever its connection, to starve its root, he would need to give it a final devastating meal, one that would choke it, not sustain it. He had to turn that weapon back on itself. He had found a way to fight back, but the cost, he instinctively knew, would be immense. He would have to descend into the manor's deepest core, into the very source of its malevolence, and confront the living stone. He would have to sacrifice something essential, something that made him him. Not entirely. The journal lay open on the dust-filmed table, its brittle pages whispering of a desperate, terrible truth. Marcus understood now. The house fed. It consumed. His hand, though still trembling, gripped the worn leather cover with renewed resolve. He was no longer a historian deciphering ancient texts. He was a combatant, staring down an ancient, malevolent adversary. He rose, the floorboards groaning in protest beneath his weight, a sound that now seemed less like decay and more like a warning growl. The air in the study thickened, acquiring a metallic tang, like ozone before a storm. Marcus ignored it. He needed to find the core, the deepest root of its hunger, the place where its tendrils burrowed deepest. The journal had hinted at a central nexus, a forgotten chamber beneath the oldest section of the manor. A heavy oak door to his left, one that had been ajar moments before, slammed shut with a concussive force that rattled the very foundations. The latch clicked, an impossible sound given its age and disrepair. He pushed through it, a quiet defiance hardening his jaw. He moved toward the staircase, intending to descend to the manor's lower levels. The grand, sweeping ascent, usually bathed in the faint light filtering through the grimy windows, was now shrouded in an unnatural gloom. He placed a foot on the first step, and the wood beneath him groaned, not with the familiar creak of age, but a resonant, almost guttural complaint. He took another step, and then another. The banister, usually smooth beneath his palm, felt rough, almost alive, its polished surface suddenly bristling with unseen splinters. As he reached the landing, the long corridor leading to the servants' quarters, a path he knew led to the cellar entrance, seemed to stretch impossibly. The far end, usually visible, was now lost in a swirling gray mist that clung to the floor. The walls appeared to ripple, their ancient wallpaper shifting, images of forgotten faces briefly coalescing in the patterns before dissolving. It vibrated in his chest, a discordant hum designed to unnerve. Marcus focused on his breath, on the solid reality of his own body. This was its play, its attempt to break his will. He stepped into the mist. Immediately, the air grew heavy, damp, and the ground beneath his feet shifted. No longer solid flagstones, but something yielding like packed mud. The walls around him dissolved, replaced by towering corrugated metal sheets, streaked with rust. Fluorescent lights, flickering erratically overhead, cast harsh, sickly yellow illumination on what now appeared to be a vast, sterile corridor. The acrid scent intensified, mingling with the unmistakable odor of stale exhaust fumes. He was no longer in the manor. He was standing before a massive steel-reinforced gate. A sign, illuminated by a single buzzing bulb, declared in stark block letters, "Border Checkpoint." A low mechanical hum vibrated through the floor. This wasn't real. It was a memory or a fabrication designed to stop him. He remembered this place, a difficult, painful crossing he'd made years ago, a pivotal moment of loss and decision. The house was trying to trap him within a personal prison, a memory cage. It was indistinct, a wavering outline, but its posture, the way it moved, resonated with a deep, forgotten anxiety within Marcus. It raised a hand, not to stop him physically, but to point. Its gesture filled with a wordless accusation that struck at his deepest regrets. This was the house's most potent weapon. Not physical violence, but psychological erosion. It wanted him to surrender, to become another memory in its vast, suffocating collection. But the journal's words echoed in his mind. Sacrifice of memory. A meal to choke, not sustain. The house fed on stolen memories, on fear and confusion. What if the key wasn't just any memory, but one given willingly, defiantly? A memory of strength, of resolve, offered as a poison, not a feast. The house could not digest defiance. It could not assimilate a conscious act of relinquishment, a memory shed with purpose rather than one ripped away. This was the revelation. This was the weakness. He straightened, a surge of adrenaline cutting through the synthetic fatigue. The spectral figure before him wavered, its accusatory hand dropping slightly. The house understood his realization. It redoubled its efforts. The checkpoint gates began to slowly, agonizingly close, the grinding metal a deafening roar. The floor beneath him tilted, threatening to throw him off balance. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing. Marcus took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the acrid air. He would give the house its final meal, a memory of absolute, unyielding resolve. And it would choke. A cold, calculated resolve hardened Marcus's features. The journal's truth had stripped away all doubt, all skepticism. The house was not merely old stone and timber. It was a hungry, ancient thing. A parasite feeding on the essence of those who dared to dwell within its walls. His self. He gripped the worn, leather-bound volume, a fragile anchor in the rising tide of the house's influence. The air in the study felt thicker, more viscous, as if the very atmosphere resisted his breath. Not a specific room marked on an archaic floor plan, but a felt presence, a magnetic pull towards the deepest, most forgotten parts of the manor. The house's core. Stepping into the main hall, Marcus noted the shift. The familiar dust motes dancing in the meager light now seemed to coalesce, forming fleeting, indistinct shapes at the periphery of his vision. The grand staircase, usually a monumental presence, appeared to writhe, its dark wood steps blurring at the edges, the banisters seeming to undulate like a petrified serpent. He ascended, his boots sinking slightly into the worn carpet, each step a deliberate act of defiance. Not auditory, but a pressure against his eardrums, a sibilant rush that carried no discernible words, yet conveyed an undeniable sense of accusation. It was the collective murmur of all the lives the house had consumed, their fragmented memories echoing in the cavernous spaces. The house was already trying to feast, attempting to nibble at the edges of his identity. The upper floors were worse. Corridors stretched and contracted, defying the known architecture. Rooms he'd never seen before, or perhaps had forgotten, materialized and vanished. He didn't turn. He couldn't afford to acknowledge the illusions, to give them substance. But he remembered the journal's terrible truth and the clarity it had brought. He pressed on. The air grew heavy, damp, carrying the scent of rich, decaying earth and something metallic like old blood. The temperature plummeted. The walls here were not plastered stone, but rough-hewn rock, seeping moisture. Ahead, a narrow passage opened, barely wide enough for his shoulders. At the end of the passage, a vast circular chamber opened. It was not lit by windows, but by an unearthly phosphorescent glow emanating from moss-like growths on the walls. In the center stood a structure, impossible and yet undeniably present. Before the gate, a single decaying wooden desk sat, barren, save for a flickering, unseen light source that illuminated a section of the floor. This was it. The border checkpoint. He felt his memories being cataloged, scanned, weighed. The details of his life, his childhood home, the face of his parents, the sound of their voices, all flickered in his mind, feeling less like his own and more like data points being processed by an indifferent, colossal intelligence. He felt the house attempting to extract these fragments, to claim them. This was the threshold. To pass, he knew he would have to surrender something vital, something fundamental. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the metallic scent of the chamber filling his lungs. He walked towards the gate, his steps echoing unnaturally in the vast space. As he approached the desk, a wave of profound disorientation washed over him. He stumbled, his vision blurring. For a terrifying moment, he couldn't recall his own name or why he was there. The house was trying to take him now, to consume him piecemeal before he could offer the final devastating meal. He fought back, clenching his fists, forcing himself to remember the journal, the plan. Choke it, don't sustain it. He focused on the raw, desperate intent behind his presence, the singular purpose that now defined him. The house demanded. It craved. It reached. He knew what it wanted. It wanted his memories, his past, his future, his sanity, and he would give it, but not as sustenance. He opened his eyes, meeting the invisible, consuming gaze of the house. Take my memories, my fears, my triumphs, my very consciousness. I give you my entire unreserved self, not to be consumed slowly, but to flood you, to overwhelm you, to poison your roots. As the words left his lips, the chamber convulsed. A low, guttural groan, not from the earth, but from the very stones of the house, reverberated through the chamber, shaking the packed soil beneath his feet. The air thickened further, pressing down on him, threatening to crush him. He felt his mind unraveling, 1,000 memories flashing, burning, then dissolving into nothingness. The house was feeding, but this time, it was a desperate, choking gulp, not a nourishing sip. It was gorging, and in its ravenous consumption, it was tearing itself apart. Marcus stood defiant, a conduit for its self-destruction, feeling his own being fraying at the edges, dissolving into the ancient, malevolent entity around him. Structure itself. The groan deepened, a sound of grinding stone and tortured timber, resonating not just through the floor, but directly within Marcus's sternum. The phosphorescent moss, previously a gentle luminescence, pulsed erratically, its light flaring like a dying heart. Grotesque shadows, previously dancing, now writhed, clawing at the walls, stretching into impossible forms that seemed to peel away the very plaster. The shadow gate, a rent in reality, widened with an audible crack that echoed the internal fracture Marcus felt. It was not air pressure, but a psychic weight, a deliberate, focused attempt to crush his resolve, to flatten his individuality. He felt a phantom hand unseen but undeniably present, reaching for his mind, attempting to unravel his thoughts like a tangled skein of yarn. He had come too far, seen too much, to surrender to a mere sensation. This was the house, not a natural phenomenon, but a conscious, malevolent force. He knew its hunger now. Dust rained from the ceiling in thick clouds, stinging his eyes and coating his tongue with the gritty taste of ancient mortar. He braced himself, planting his feet wide, his hands instinctively reaching out to steady himself against the unseen assault. They were not ghosts. They were parts. Parts of the house, perhaps, but also parts of those who had been consumed. He saw an eye wide and terrified, staring out from a knot in a wooden beam, its iris swirling with the same unnatural light. This was the event. This was the true nature of its absorption. Not a simple erasure, but a grotesque integration, a perpetual conscious existence within the very fabric of the manor. The house didn't just feed on memories. It became them, becoming the shattered remnants of its inhabitants, each consciousness a new nerve ending in its vast living anatomy. He saw himself, for a terrifying moment, his own face distorted, his body contorted, slowly merging with a section of the wall, his eyes pleading from the plaster. The thought was a spike of ice through his chest. A sudden sharp tug pulled at his consciousness. He felt a distinct, almost physical sensation of being stretched, his identity thinning, his grasp on his own thoughts weakening. It was a border checkpoint, a threshold where individual consciousness was weighed against the house's insatiable hunger. Once across, there was no turning back, only absorption. It was the primary aperture through which it assimilated its victims. It was where the individual ended and the house began. But Marcus was determined. He would not yield. He had to wound it. Not physically, for it was too vast, too ancient, but at this critical juncture, this border checkpoint of its consumption. He remembered the ancient texts, the subtle rituals of warding, the symbols of disruption. They were not for ghosts, but for entities. With a defiant roar that was swallowed by the house's groan, Marcus pulled free a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. It was mundane, utterly incongruous with the metaphysical horror unfolding, but it was solid. It was real. He held it like a weapon, though he knew its material form was irrelevant. It was his intent, his refusal to be absorbed. That was the true force. He lunged, not at the shimmering gate itself, but at the phosphorescent moss that pulsed around its edges, the very manifestation of the house's living energy. He plunged the poker into the moss, not with a physical thrust, but with a surge of concentrated will, channeling every ounce of his defiance, his rejection of its absorption, his refusal to become another lost memory. The moss, where the poker made contact, shriveled instantly, turning black and brittle, letting out a silent, sickening hiss that only Marcus could perceive. The house shrieked, a sound of pure agony that was not heard with ears, but felt in the marrow of his bones. The lines of light within its depths flickered, then vanished. The ground beneath Marcus bucked, throwing him off balance. He fell, the poker clattering beside him, his head striking the stone floor with a dull thud. He lay there, disoriented, the groan of the house slowly receding, replaced by a low, mournful hum. When Marcus pushed himself up, his head throbbing, the chamber was silent. The phosphorescent moss was still, its light dim, almost extinguished. The air was still, heavy, but the crushing pressure had receded. He had inflicted a wound, a devastating one perhaps. But as he stood there, his body aching, his mind reeling, Marcus felt different. He felt its presence, not as an external threat, but as an echo within him, a low thrum that resonated with his own heartbeat. Had he escaped? Or had the wound merely altered the nature of his absorption, leaving him entwined with the house in a way he could not yet comprehend? The line between Marcus and the manor had blurred, irrevocably. The choice had been made, but the consequences were only just beginning to unfold.